When you're admitted to a hospital, they give you a right wristband with your name on it. But there are different colored wristbands that mean other things. Purple wristbands are put on the people who don't want to be revived if they die. Yellow wristbands are put on the people who are at risk of falling. And red wristbands are put on the dead people. One night, a surgeon was working the night shift at a hospital. She had just finished her operation and was headed down to the basement. She entered the elevator, and there's only one other person in there. The woman in the elevator had black hair and pale skin. She smiled kindly at the surgeon, but just something was a little off about her smile. The surgeon chatted casually with the woman as the elevator went down. When the elevator opened, a man was about to enter before the surgeon rushed to close the door and then pushed a button to the first floor. The other woman in the elevator looked at her in shock and asked her why she didn't let that man in. "I just operated on him. He died during the surgery. Didn't you see the red wristband he was wearing?" She gave the surgeon an innocent smile, then raised her arm, showing off her red wristband. "Something like this?" Surgeon looked strangely at the woman. "Where did you find that?" she asked, thinking it was just a joke. The woman kept smiling, and the surgeon could only watch in fear as the once beautiful woman turned into a horrifying creature. The elevator dinged, signaling that they had made it to the first floor, and in the blink of an eye, the monster was a normal person again. "Have a nice night, doctor," it called as it left the surgeon stunned in the elevator, leaving out the doors like nothing had happened. The love of my life left me today. I found out when I returned to our house. I went straight to his room and opened his closet. The only thing I saw were stray hangers thrown across the floor. It seemed like he left in a rush. I was heartbroken to have the one I loved so much leave me. I'd never felt so empty in my life. In a daze, I wandered his house. I found myself in his kitchen, and the memories we shared came flooding back. On his kitchen island was a letter. I picked it up and hoped it explained where he went. "Dear Jenny, I'm sorry. I can't keep this a secret anymore. She found me again, and I'm afraid she'll hurt you too. I have to leave, for the sake of both of us. I hope you'll forgive me." There was no signature. I set the letter down, too shocked to speak. Then I heard the front door open. Adrenaline rushed through me as I grabbed a kitchen knife and then hid in the pantry. "Hello?" a young lady called out. "Anyone home?" The intruder saw the letter on the counter. I could see her pick up the letter through the small crack I left in the door. She scanned it over for a minute. Then I saw tears stream down her face. I took this as my chance to strike. I slammed the door open and buried my knife deep into her back. Finally, the one I loved would come back to me. With her gone, I could be with him once more. I just needed to find him again. Then we'd be together forever. "Welcome home, Jenny." I smiled as Jenny bled out. If I could find him once, I could find him again. It was a Friday night, and I went to a party with a couple of my friends. It was a pretty fun night, although I don't remember much. Maybe a cute guy or two, but that's pretty much it. Whenever I got back home, it was already around 2 a.m. I was ready to go to sleep, but then I realized I didn't have my phone. I searched all around my house and still couldn't find it. I looked under all the couch cushions, in my kitchen, and even in the fridge. I wondered if I left it at the party from earlier. I went to use a home phone and dialed my number to see if anyone picked it up. Surprisingly, someone answered. "Hello?" I spoke into the phone. The person on the other line didn't speak. All I could hear was them breathing. I started feeling kind of creeped out, and I didn't know what to say. I was starting to get more and more worried about my phone. All my private info was on there, including my address. "Can you hear me?" I asked.
"I hear you,"
a voice replies. There's silence for a moment. Then the person hangs up. I keep calling, but no one picks up. I started to give up and decide that I was probably never going to get it back. By now, an hour had passed, and it was already around 3 a.m. so I decided it was best if I just went to sleep and dealt with it in the morning. I walked into my room, jumped into my bed, then pulled back the covers. I froze. I caught something out of the corner of my eye. My phone! Thank God. I nearly laughed. It was so simple. I just left it on my bedside table. A forgotten detail made me pause. If I had left it in my house, who picked it up? A creaking noise made me freeze. The closet door was edging open, and I swear I could make out fingers grasping the edge. During my first year of college, I spent most of my time out at parties. On the other hand, my roommate was dedicated to keeping his GPA high. He studied almost every hour of every day. Despite our differences, I still considered him a great friend. I admired his dedication and invited him to a party with me on a Saturday night. He hesitantly declined, saying he had to study more because he had a test on Monday. I told him it was okay and not to wait up for me because I'd probably be coming home late. We bid our goodbyes, and then I went to go hang out with my friends. Me and my friends ended up spending most of our night at a party. One of them convinced me to stay at their house for a sleepover. I ended up agreeing, but I told them I needed to go back to my apartment to grab some clothes. Whenever I got back to my apartment, the door was unlocked and all the lights were turned off. I figured my roommate went to sleep early and left the door open so I wouldn't wake him up. I quickly got some clothes, then grabbed my keys without turning on the lights. I locked the door, then left to my friend's house, not bothering to check on my roommate. The next morning, I walked back to my apartment. The front door was unlocked, which was weird, because I remember locking it last night before I left. I opened the door and went inside my roommate's room to ask if he wanted to go out for breakfast. I screamed at the sight. My roommate was dead. On the wall was a message written with his blood.
Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the light?
My day has started off normal. The only unusual thing was my parents inviting me to their house for dinner. As I stepped out of the house, I clicked the button on the keys to unlock my car doors. I shivered when the cold breeze hit me. The night air was a bit chilly, so I stepped back into my house to grab a jacket, then headed back to my car. I knew I would be late if I didn't pick up the pace. I glanced at my rearview mirror to back out, almost looking back down again before I paused and checked the mirror again. Had something been in my view? I swore I saw something move. I shrugged it off and returned to my hurry routine. After being on the road for about 10 minutes, I realized my gas tank was almost empty. I pulled into a close gas station that was almost completely deserted. I asked the attendant to fill my tank as I looked for my wallet. For a second, I met eyes with the attendant. It was a guy who looked somewhat young. He was acting very anxious the whole time, which also put me on edge. I watched as he closely looked at my car. Then he asked me to step out for a second so he could show me something. I was kind of suspicious of him, but I decided to just follow what he said. I didn't want to get stranded in the middle of nowhere. I opened my car door and stepped out. Before I knew it, he grabbed me and put his hand over my mouth. He told me to come with him and to not make any noise. Then he pulled me into the station as I struggled to get away and call for help. I thought this was the end for me in that moment. As soon as we got in the gas station, he let go of me and told me something that sent chills down my spine. There's a random man hiding in your back seat. I didn't want him to know I saw him, so I brought you here. Together we called the police and reported the guy. Whenever the police arrived, they searched my car. Later on, I found out the guy was actually a wanted serial killer, planning to kill me as soon as he got the chance. I thanked the gas station attendant over and over again. It seemed like he saved my life. I ended up making it to my parents' house safely. It was around 1 a.m. The sky was nearly pitch black. The moon was a faint, faraway spotlight compared to the flickering yellow streetlights that lit up my way. I had taken a walk late at night since I got home from work extremely late and couldn't fall asleep. Although it seemed like I was the only one out, I still remembered to be extremely aware of my surroundings. I lived in a shady apartment complex, so it wasn't unusual for me to keep my guard up, especially alone at night. The street was completely empty, except for a van parked on the side of the road. I kept my head straight and tried to avoid eye contact with the car. In the dark, I could see a silhouette of 3 men getting out the car together. Despite my efforts not to look, I still glanced over as I passed. When I let my eyes adjust to the dark, I could make out that 2 of the men were holding up another one in between them. In my mind, I didn't see anything weird about it. I just assumed they were carrying their drunk friend home from the bar. There was a dark stain on the front of the shirt on the guy in the middle. I couldn't tell the color in the dim light, but it looked new. My nose shriveled up. He reeked. He must have thrown up on himself. The only other noticeable thing about him was his blonde hair. When they saw me staring at them, they hurried away quicker. It seemed like they didn't want me to interact with them, which I didn't plan on doing. I accidentally made eye contact with one of them. His eyes glared at me. Then he continued to carry his friend away. I looked away because he gave me the creeps. There was something not right about him. When I looked back, the men were gone. This time I decided this was getting too weird and started to walk back to my apartment. Whenever I made it back to my apartment complex, I heard some strange noises from the side of the building. I ignored my gut feeling and hurried back to my room. I decided to just report it in the morning. All night I kept thinking about the weird encounter with the men. Something just didn't feel right. Eventually I was finally able to sleep. In the morning, I entered the elevator to go to work. I almost forgot about the whole scene the night before, but then I saw a poster hanging up on the side of the elevator that made me freeze. A dead body had been found near the building. I walked outside and caught a glimpse of the body. The dead man had a familiar dark stain on his shirt and blonde hair. I came to a horrifying realization. Last night those men weren't carrying their friend. They were moving a dead body. When I was 17, my aunt asked me to house sit for her. It wasn't my first time house sitting, and I wasn't busy that weekend, so I accepted the offer. The plan was that I would house sit from Friday to Sunday while she went out of town. I arrived at her place Friday evening. When I went inside, she told me to be careful at night because her basement lock didn't work. I told her I would be fine and that she didn't have to worry about anything. After she finished explaining all her rules, I stood in the driveway and waved goodbye to her as she left. Her house was somewhat large, so I began to make sure everything was nice and neat to avoid cleaning up later. I closed all the room doors, then headed downstairs and turned on a movie. I glanced at the basement door, remembering what my aunt said, then turned my attention to the movie as it began. While laying on the couch, I somehow drifted off. When I woke up, all I could hear was a mysterious sound. I sat up on the couch, pausing the movie and looking around to try and figure out where it was coming from. My eyes went towards the basement door. It was open slightly, although I definitely remember closing it a while ago. Something about the thought of going down to the basement all alone at night sent chills down my spine. I hadn't been to the basement yet, so I couldn't even think of what the noise could be. Even if I was being extremely paranoid, I still decided to call the police. When an operator picked up, I calmly told her the situation. I told her that it wasn't a big deal, so they didn't have to rush. I hung up the phone, then kept on glancing at the basement door. In less than 5 minutes, 4 cops were at my front door. One cop pulled me to the side and explained that whenever I hung up the phone, the operator heard a second click, meaning someone else was in the house. listening to the phone call. The police officers came out with a deranged man in handcuffs. One of the officers explained that they found him sitting on top of the washer, using a machete to bang the washer and dryer, trying to lure me down. In the summer, I started a new job at a small wedding dress store in my town. There wasn't anything that made the wedding dress store stand out from usual stores, except a mannequin that always creeped me out. It had been there whenever I started working, so I didn't know how old it was. I tried to stay away from it most of the time, even if it seemed silly to be scared of something that can't hurt me. The mannequin was so unnaturally lifelike. Her eyes were so dull, yet they looked so pretty. She had soft makeup on her pale skin, and she always looked like she was blushing slightly. And her hair was so beautiful, it almost looked real. She looked like an actual bride ready to get married any minute. Another weird thing about her was that she always smelled like chemicals, unlike the other normal mannequins. I never asked the store owner why she looked so real. He wasn't very friendly, and he didn't talk to me at all. Sometimes I caught him staring at the mannequin, which made it even weirder. One day, I was working late, and I was tidying the owner's office. I saw a photo on his desk. It was a photo of him and a girl that looked exactly like the mannequin. I smiled, guessing that maybe he'd based the mannequin off his wife. I put the picture back and left the room. The next day, I was talking to my coworker about how sweet it was that our boss made a mannequin based off his wife. My coworker looked confused and said something that made me realize there was a much darker story behind the mannequin. You know his wife is dead, right? My heart dropped, and I looked over at the lifelike mannequin that stood in front of the store. That was definitely not a mannequin. Afterwards, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was too much of a coincidence. After work one day, I decided to tell my best friend who worked at the police station. At first he told me I was just being paranoid, but he still decided to look into it. After more investigation, it was proven that the mannequin was actually the owner's dead wife's corpse, who had been preserved to look young forever. He admitted that the day before their wedding, she had been thinking of calling it off, so he killed her so she wouldn't leave him, then preserved her body as a mannequin for the store. He was arrested, and the corpse was properly buried, but I'll never forget her lifelike eyes, staring at me like she was pleading for help. After I spent a late night at the office, I walked to the bus stop to go home. This was a daily routine for me, and nothing weird had ever happened before, so I wasn't really aware of my surroundings. I sat down at the bus stop and a man sat down next to me. I didn't really think anything of him, because a lot of people rode the bus at night. The only thing I found strange about him was the fact that he kept glancing at me until the bus came. I just put in my earbuds and hoped he would look the other way. When the bus finally arrived, I sat down at my usual spot, and I thought that was the end of his creepiness. I was wrong, because he sat behind me, and I could feel him continue to stare at me. I just stared out the window, and I brushed him off as another creepy guy. Eventually, the bus got to my stop. He stood up to get off, and I felt a sigh of relief escape my lips. I told myself I would just get off the next stop to avoid him, then walk back to my house. He turned back, and then stared directly at me. I realized he was waiting for me to get up and leave too. I stayed seated, playing oblivious. Did he somehow know my routine? Whenever he saw that I wasn't going to get up, he went to go sit back down. I sweated nervously. I didn't know what to do. He was definitely waiting for me to get off so he could follow me. Whenever I was lost in my thoughts, the bus went to the last stop. I waited for someone else to get up so I could walk next to them. I looked around the bus, and my heart dropped. We were the only two on the bus. He got up and smiled at me, knowing now that I had to get off. I gathered up all my courage and walked towards the door. I knew I would have to run to make sure he didn't get me. Just as I was about to head out, the bus driver grabbed my hand. "Do you know him?" he asked. I shook my head, and the bus driver took another look at him before closing the doors. The man banged on the doors, screaming to let him in. The bus driver called the police and waited with me inside the bus as the man screamed. The police came and arrested the man after they found out he had been a wanted suspect in the kidnapping of a girl 2 weeks prior. Me and the bus driver actually ended up becoming good friends because of the situation, and it's still a story I tell to this day. In my second year of college, I decided to get a job at a cafe near my apartment. When I arrived for the interview, I noticed the cafe was extremely crowded. I told the manager I was here for an interview, and they hired me on the spot without any sort of background check. I started working right away. The work was surprisingly easy, and all my coworkers were extremely nice to me, especially my boss. At first, I appreciated how friendly he was, but honestly, it was like he was a little too friendly to me, to the point of it being creepy. It was weird, but I liked my job, so I didn't say anything. After getting more comfortable with my job, I worked the late shift one night. Eventually, the only ones left at the shop were me and my boss. When it was time to close, he offered to walk me home since it was dangerous to walk alone at night. I hesitantly agreed. I grabbed my bag and led the way to my apartment. The walk was awkward and silent, until he asked if I lived alone. I didn't want him to know I lived by myself, so I just said I lived with my older brother. Eventually we got to my apartment building, and I thanked him for walking me home. I walked inside the lobby and noticed he wasn't walking away. I looked outside the window as I walked up the stairs. It looked like my boss was still waiting outside. It was weird, but I continued to walk up the stairs while passing by the window. By the time I got to the 4th floor, he was still there. I don't know why, but I kept walking even if I lived on the 4th floor. My feet moved on their own, passing by every floor window. Eventually, when I got to the 7th floor, I sat underneath the window and peeked out to see if he was still outside. I looked closely at him and noticed he was counting something. I sat there dumbfounded before I realized what he was doing. He was counting what floor I lived on. I covered my mouth and watched as he started walking away. I walked back down to the 4th floor, making sure to avoid all the windows, just in case he was still there. The next day, my neighbor greeted me when I walked out my apartment and warned me to be careful. I asked him why, and he told me there had been a break-in on the 7th floor. My mind automatically thought of what happened yesterday. It was just a coincidence, right? I brushed it off and went to work. My coworker told me my boss called in sick that day, so I was able to relax while doing my job. That night I took the late shift. After my shift ended, I kept my guard up while walking home. I got to my apartment and unlocked the door. As I closed and locked the door behind me, I noticed something odd. My bedroom door was slightly open, even though I always close it before I leave. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I went to my room and played on my phone for a little bit before drifting off to sleep. In the middle of the night, I opened my eyes because I felt something shuffling beneath my bed. My thoughts went towards the break-in that happened on the 7th floor. I looked underneath my bed and saw 2 eyes staring back at me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and fell off my bed. I sprinted out the apartment into my neighbor's door. My neighbor came back to my apartment with me and dragged the guy out from underneath my bed. I recognized the face immediately. It was my boss. When the cops arrived, they arrested him for breaking and entering my house and the house on the 7th floor. On a boring summer day, my parents forced me to clean out the basement. While going through the boxes, I noticed a box that looked like a board game. I picked it up and saw it was an Ouija board. I sent a photo of the Ouija board to my friends and asked them if they wanted to give it a try. It seemed like the perfect way to make this day more exciting, so we all agreed to meet up later that night at my house when my parents weren't home. Later on that night, everyone arrived at my house. At first we had fun scaring each other with different possible scenarios, laughing at the thought of an actual ghost. Then I brought out the Ouija board. It looked like one of those antique ones from the olden days. We lit a few candles, turned off all the lights, and began our session. We weren't sure how to properly use the board, so I started off with the most cliche question ever. Is there anyone there? We all sat there anxiously, waiting for the planchette to move. After a moment of silence, one of our friends jerked the planchette and our other friend screamed. We started laughing at how ridiculous this was. After calming down, we decided to give it another try. We put our hands on the planchette and asked a different question. If there's anyone there, we would like to make contact. We were just about to give up, but the room started to become colder, and the shadows around us seemed to move. No one said anything, but everyone had the same exact thoughts. There's something else here with us. I was getting a little excited at this point. It was like we were in an actual horror movie. We began asking more questions. Did you die here? How did you die? Are you an evil spirit or a bad spirit? Nothing happened, but now we were all beginning to become bored. Until my friend asked a different question. Do you want to hurt us? The planchette started moving. We all held our breath when we saw where it was going. To the word, yes. Suddenly all the candles went out. We all started panicking, and everyone was pretty much screaming. I went for the light switch, but the power was out. We all ran out the house and stood at the driveway, collecting our thoughts and trying to calm down. After we searched the house for anyone who might have wandered in, everyone went home. There was nothing else to do that night. I was feeling extremely unsettled being alone in that house, with whatever just said they wanted to hurt us. I couldn't sleep the whole night. I felt like there was something else in my room, watching me. The next day, me and my friends met up. Everyone said creepy things happened to them that night as well. One of my friends' TV turned on in the middle of the night, and the only thing playing was static. He swore his remote was on his desk, and he wasn't sure how it turned on at all. Our other friend's dog woke up at 3 a.m. She said he was barking loudly at her closet door. She opened the door, but there was no one there. Her dog still refused to go near it. I still don't have an explanation on why those things happened to us, but thank God nothing happened after that. I haven't played or gotten near an Ouija board since. In middle school, me and my best friend were obsessed with filming haunted places. We pretty much explored every haunted place in the city, but never saw anything interesting. We were wandering around the woods when we came across a house that looked abandoned for a long time. We were stoked at the idea of a new adventure, so we decided to go in. The doors had locks, but we were able to get rid of them rather easily. We walked into the house and looked around with our flashlights. Although it was dark and somewhat old, the house wasn't in bad condition. The closets were still filled up with clothes, the fridge was filled with rotten food, and there were still family photos hanging up. As we investigated the place more, we realized the house didn't look like it had been moved out of, but just straight up abandoned. I paused for a second and looked at one of the family photos. Something about it just gave me the utter creeps. Without me noticing, my friend had wandered into a room while I was staring at the family photo. I heard her scream and ran to where she was. I don't know why, but she was completely freaked out. I turned my head to the corner of the room and saw something extremely unsettling. It was a porcelain doll, sitting on a rocking chair. The doll had glossy blue eyes, blonde hair, and a fluffy dress. Normally, creepy dolls don't bother me, but this doll had a huge crack on its cheek, and nothing about it seemed like a little girl would love to play with it. As I was looking at the doll, the chair began to rock back and forth. Me and my friend glanced at each other, both knowing no sort of breeze could have gotten into this room. The chair suddenly stopped rocking, and that's what prompted us to get out of that creepy house. Later on, when we watched the recording at home, we noticed the doll's head move slightly when my friend entered the room. We tried to research the house to see if there was any sort of backstory, but we couldn't find any. Neither of us had any sort of idea on why there was a creepy doll there. A couple of nights afterwards, I was getting ready for bed when my best friend called me. I picked up the phone, and she sounded panicked. She started to explain what happened. She was home alone when the doorbell rang. She opened the door and saw something on her welcome mat that terrified her. Porcelain doll of herself. I was creeped out just hearing her explain it, and told her to come to my house as soon as possible. I heard a knock on my door as soon as I hung up. I opened the door, ready to greet her, when I had a horrifying sight instead. It was a porcelain doll of me. When I was younger, I had moved to a really old house. The neighbors used to spread rumors often about our house, but we never paid any attention to them. Within my first week of living there, I came down with a really bad fever, so my mom decided that bed rest was the best option for me. It was lonely, but I managed. During my time being bedridden, I made an imaginary friend. It started when my mom and I were looking at the night sky. Suddenly we saw a shooting star. She told me to make a wish, and for some reason, I wished for a friend. The night after that, something came into my bedroom window. He introduced himself as Mr. Star. As a young kid, I thought he was magical, but looking back now as an adult, he was seriously insane. Even after 10 years, his face is still fresh in my mind. At first, you might think everything is normal about him. He wore a black suit that fit him perfectly, and he had white hair that looked like stars sewn together. But there was one thing that made him inhuman: his eyes. His left eye looked like a star was forced into his eye socket. It was large and grotesquely mutilated. His right eye had a star-shaped pupil, while the rest of his eye was completely black. I became good friends with Mr. Star. Even though he was just imaginary, it felt like he was actually real. We did what normal friends did at first. Playing board games, hide and seek around the house, things like that. He told me if I told my parents about him, we'd never be able to play again, so I didn't. Mr. Star was always talking about this fun place over the hill behind my house. He never told me what it was specifically, just that I would love it there, and that there were tons of other kids there that he used to play with. Mr. Star slowly became more and more violent as the days went by. He would come in with kitchen knives, insisting that we juggle them. And when I said no, he would disappear for days at a time, like he was having a temper tantrum. He was my only friend, so I was always happy when he came back, and everything would go back to normal, until he decided he wanted to play another dangerous game. After a month of living at that house, my family had decided to move again. I was kind of relieved to get away from Mr. Star, even though he kept me company. I still knew he was dangerous. I still remember his face in my bedroom window when I sat in the car. He didn't look sad like I expected. He looked upset, like he wanted to hurt me. Years later, I came back to the house. By this time, I was already an adult, but I still remembered my imaginary friend. Out of curiosity, I went over the hill to see if there was actually a place for kids there. I saw something in the distance, and the closer I got, the more terrified I became. It was a cemetery. I was shocked, but everything actually started to make sense. I left the place as soon as possible. When I ran to my car, I swore I saw a familiar face in the window, but I sped away before I could process it. I'm never going back to that place ever again. I just hope that the next kid that moves there won't fall for Mr. Star's tricks like I almost did. Me and my friends were dumb teenagers who liked to do anything for entertainment. We were playing a classic game of truth or dare. Most of the dares were mediocre. Things like ding-dong ditching and prank calls. One of my friends asked me, truth or dare? I picked dare, because the game was becoming a little boring. My friends smirked at each other, then dared me to go into the abandoned mall. The abandoned mall was pretty famous in our town. Everyone said it was haunted. It was rumored that if you went into the mall, you would never come out. No one knew who owned it or why it was abandoned, but the city just pretended like it didn't exist. That didn't stop dumb kids like us from breaking in and having fun. We drove up to the abandoned mall and I got out the car. I looked into the car window while I walked out, and I saw all of them laughing at me. I told myself I only had to make it 20 minutes. How bad can it be? I walked into the mall with confidence, but it quickly faded into the dark halls. Everything about that place just gave me the chills. There were lots of disfigured but realistic mannequins, broken store windows, and the mall was almost completely pitch black, except for the moon peering in from the ceiling windows. I stood in front of a store window with old TVs. It felt weird seeing my own reflection in the television screens. I froze when I heard a creepy song start to play. I quickly realized it was coming from the mall speakers. The place had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, so someone had to be manually playing the music. As I stared at the speaker on the ceiling, I realized I never heard that song before. I knew one thing for sure though. There was something else in the mall with me. One look at my phone told me I had 10 minutes left. I wanted to have a good story to tell my friends later, so I went to the mall's office to see who was playing the music. The closer I got, the louder the music became. I peered into the small glass window on the door. I saw a man sitting there, with his back turned to me. I almost knocked on the door, before I caught a whiff of how bad he smelled. I stared at him to see what he was doing, but suddenly he turned around. Even in the darkness, I knew he was staring straight at me. He almost didn't look human. While I was frozen in fear, he stood up. He was over 6 feet tall, towering over me. I hit the wall while backing up. I held in my screaming as I ran away. My adrenaline kicked in, and I was almost at the front door in less than a minute. I tried to open the doors, but they had been locked. At this point, I was pretty much panicking. No thoughts ran in my head other than get out. I sprinted into a nearby store and hid underneath the counter. The music stopped playing, and I almost felt relieved. But now that it was silent, I could hear footsteps getting closer to me. I sat there with my hands over my mouth, trying to muffle my breathing. I could hear him dragging something as he walked closer. I heard silence, and I peeked my head out from behind the counter. There was no one there. I was about to stand up, before I heard a voice whisper from behind me. "Found you." Every October, I would work at a corn maze for a barn that hosted a haunted house. My other friends worked inside the barn as monsters to scare people, and I ended up with the lame job of making sure no one snuck into the corn maze for free. You would assume my job was boring, but there was lots of weird things surrounding the corn maze. Some of my coworkers would scare me by saying that if I lost track of a kid, they ended up as a meal for the creature that lives in the corn maze. I never believed them for a second, but I still made sure to keep track of everyone that went in and out the corn maze. The maze was huge, So it wasn't a surprise to me if someone actually got lost in there. Luckily, the owner gave me a map to navigate the maze, just in case someone really got lost. Every night before I left, I had to go through the entire maze to make sure no one was still there. On a particular night, I was going through my usual routine when I noticed that the coin maze had an extra path. I double-checked my map and knew for sure it wasn't there yesterday. I decided to take a look down the path, just in case someone got lost there. As I continued walking, I felt like I heard footsteps that weren't mine. I stood still for a second, and the footsteps stopped a second after. I thought maybe one of my coworkers were messing with me, so I turned around ready to yell at them. I caught myself by surprise when there was no one there. I knew I was probably just being paranoid at this point. I told myself I was the only one in the corn maze, but deep down, I felt like I wasn't. I thought back to the creature that my friend said lived in the corn maze. I shook my head, denying the possibility. Eventually I came to a dead end, and realized I was completely lost. I turned around to attempt to navigate my way back to the barn, when I saw a shadow quickly move behind a corner. At this point, I was annoyed. "I know you're there," I said out loud. I turned to look into the corn maze and saw something. I felt my heart drop, but then I realized it was just a scarecrow. I felt a little dumb, but laughed while I walked out the maze. I heard some rustling, and then I turned back. The scarecrow was gone. I tried to pretend like I didn't notice, and walked normally towards where I thought the exit was. I knew I didn't know the way, so I just tried to stall for as long as possible. Someone would notice I was missing, right?
Was that scarecrow always here?
It was October 31st, Halloween night. My friends and I were going trick-or-treating together. We knew this would probably be our last year trick-or-treating, so we tried to make the most of it. I was Frankenstein, and my other friends went as a witch, vampire, and demon. The sky got dark quick, which set the mood for the night even more. I lived in a relatively safe neighborhood, so we weren't on our guard about anything. Plus, we were already teenagers, so my parents didn't come with us. While going around, we suddenly came across a red ball on the floor. I picked it up and realized it was a clown nose. I looked at my friends and jokingly asked who dropped their nose. We all laughed about it, and then I stuck the clown nose in my pocket, not thinking much about it. We continued to go around and collect candy. All the other kids slowly went home, and around 9 p.m., we were the only ones on the street. My friends and I began to walk back to my house. Halloween was on a Thursday, so no one planned on staying the night. While we were walking, one of my friends elbowed me. I looked at them confused. They gestured behind us, and in the distance, I could see someone standing behind a streetlight. My friends and I looked at each other, but none of us really knew what to say. One of our friends called out, "Do you need something?" The man behind the streetlight stepped into view. He was a tall man, in a weird clown costume. One thing was missing from his costume though, his nose. I could tell he was staring straight at us. Admittedly, he looked way too old to be trick-or-treating. If this was any other day, we probably would have went running. But since it was Halloween, we just assumed it was a guy wanting to have fun. He finally spoke up.
I think you have something in mind.
We were all stunned, and I felt the clown nose in my pocket. This? I threw the clown nose on the ground between us. I could tell my friends were getting creeped out, and we were all slowly backing away. He started walking closer, but he completely ignored the clown nose and just started sprinting towards us. We were all sprinting towards my house at this point, screaming like little kids. When we got to my house, I took my key out from my bag, then quickly unlocked the door. We all ran inside my house, out of breath. My parents were at a Halloween party, so it was just us home alone. One of my friends looked through the blinds, and we saw nothing. We all started to slowly talk about what happened, and tried to decide what to do next. Someone suddenly started knocking on the door. My friends and I held our breath, as we heard the knocks getting louder. At this point, we thought he would break the door down. Then suddenly, the knocks just stopped. I peeked out from the blinds and saw nothing. My friends and I concluded that it was just some weird guy trying to scare us. My friends went home together, and I went back inside my house. I looked at my table, and I saw the familiar red clown nose. I remember taking it out my pocket. So how did it get back in my house? After turning 18, I barely spoke to my family because of how strange they were. I mainly just spent the holidays by myself or with friends. It was lonely, but it was better than being with my extremely strange relatives. I can't explain why, but being around them just made me sick to my stomach. When a letter arrived on my doorstep, I was unpleasantly surprised to see it was from my family. I opened the letter up and read it. It was an invite to my grandfather's funeral on Thanksgiving. He was one of the few people in the family who treated me kindly, so I decided to pay my respects. I also knew I would have no one to spend Thanksgiving with, because my roommate hadn't been home in days. The invitation also mentioned to bring a side dish for dinner, so I stayed up all night cooking one of my favorite soups. After work that day, I packed all my things up and got ready to spend the night at a hotel. It was a long and silent 4-hour drive, but I didn't mind it. The funeral was held at my grandpa's home. I didn't question it. It was probably a special request of his before passing, or a weird decision my family had come up with. I arrived at my late grandpa's house. I was unsurprisingly greeted coldly by my family. I assumed they didn't take it well that I hadn't seen them for the past 5 years. I brushed them off. I was here for my grandfather and no one else. I set my soup onto the table, and then chatted with some of my cousins that I hadn't seen in a while. I could feel how two-faced they were. They weren't actually concerned about how I was doing, or if my life turned out the way I planned. They were just putting up an act with a pretty smile. No one in this family was normal. My grandfather's casket was located in the living room. It was a closed casket, but I still felt sad just looking at it. The sun slowly began setting, and my delusional aunt had come out with a Thanksgiving turkey. One thing caught my eye. The turkey was abnormally huge. Maybe I was just used to small ones because my friends and I couldn't afford big ones. But I wonder why they needed such a big turkey, when our family could barely finish a normal-sized one. Everyone got a slice of turkey, along with some sides that everyone brought. All of my family members were complimenting me on my soup, to which I only replied with a smile. We sat around the table, talking about the best memories with Grandpa. I couldn't help but notice my delusional aunt grinning ear to ear as everyone spoke. She would glance at me every now and then, and give me an even bigger unnatural smile. In the middle of one of my uncles talking, a scream ran throughout the room. Everyone turned their heads to the source. One of my aunts had spit out a human eyeball onto the ground. Everyone saw the source of where the eyeball was from. My soup. My other cousins started coughing, and all sorts of disfigured body parts poured out their mouths. Everyone was screaming in realization of what they had just eaten. All I did was give them a pretty smile. No one was normal in this family, including me. Winter is a season I feel neutral about. Of course, it's nice to have a couple of days off work, but at the same time, it's grueling to be alone around the holidays. Being a broke college student, I couldn't afford a ticket to see my family over winter break, so I was prepared to spend the holidays alone once again. Seeing how upset I was about not being able to go home, my best friend offered to stay at his family's small cabin in the woods. He told me his family was going on vacation out of town, so the place would be free for as long as I'd like. Hearing this news, I was ecstatic. This would be the first time since I entered college that I would actually feel like Christmas. Before giving me the keys, he warned me not to open the door for anyone. Absolutely anyone, especially if they knocked at night. I thanked him, but didn't think much about his warning. On Christmas Eve, I began the long drive there. I listened to Christmas music the whole way. Looking at the snow falling, it finally felt like the holidays. As I continued driving, I noticed there wasn't any houses for miles. Once I arrived at the cabin, it was easy for me to settle in. I opened my book with my hot cocoa and sat peacefully by the fireplace, just like I imagined. Before long, the sun had already set, and the only thing I could hear beyond my breathing was a fire crackling. My peaceful silence was soon interrupted by knocking on the door. "Please let me in. It's so cold out here." I froze in my seat, staring at the window closest to the door. I stood up, trying to get a better look of who was outside. It was a little girl, wearing a dress that looked very antique. I was taken back when she stared back at me. Her pupils were completely black. "It looks so warm in there. Please let me in." I slowly reached towards the doorknob, almost in a trance, but stopped. This just wasn't right. No human could have completely black eyes. I put out the fire, hoping she would just think no one was home and go away. That was definitely not a little girl. I could only hold in my screams as I heard the knocking getting louder. The little girl repeating the same 3 words. "Please let me in."
Please let me in.
Please let me in.
After what felt like hours, the knocking somehow stopped. Light poured in from the windows, and I didn't sleep at all that night. I wondered if I imagined the whole thing. To double check, I opened the door, and my heart dropped. There were child footsteps circling around the cabin. Needless to say, I packed up all my stuff and left that very day. I couldn't get out of there soon enough. After I got back home, I told my friend about what had happened at the cabin. He seemed to hesitate, then told me the reason that his family stopped staying there was because some of his family members would see a little girl walking around at night, and when they tried to approach her, they would see her black eyes. Whenever most people think of Christmas, they think of presents and Santa. For me, I think of a phenomenon that happened to me when I was younger. As a kid, my cousins always used to joke that if you saw Santa, his elves would use the ends of their pointy shoes to poke your eyes out. Being a dumb kid, I actually believed them. So every Christmas Eve night, I would hide under my blanket, trying to sleep so I wouldn't get my eyes ripped out by elves. My plan had always worked. except for when I was 6. That Christmas Eve, my mom and I had put out cookies and milk for Santa before going to bed. After that, I followed my Christmas tradition of hiding under my blanket. In the dead of the night, I could hear someone digging in the fridge downstairs. I was still scared of the thought of elves poking my eyes out. But my curiosity got the best of my 6-year-old self, and I had to see what Santa looked like. I walked down the stairs, expecting to see a jolly old man in a red suit, with a big white beard eating our cookies. Instead, I was greeted by some sort of creature. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it definitely wasn't human. It was gulping down all the food in our fridge. I could only stare at it, and once it noticed me, it stared back. It had large and sharp teeth, covered with red liquid. Ketchup, probably. I didn't really know how to react. Was this thing supposed to be Santa? The creature stood on 2 legs, then walked around the house after emptying our fridge. It looked at our Christmas tree, our presents, and decorations. I stood there, watching the monster walk around. Then it paused for a second, and it stared straight at me, while smiling.
I'll be back.
I watched as it went up the chimney. The only proof of its existence was my empty fridge. On Christmas morning, I tried to tell my mom about what I saw, but she told me I was just imagining things. Even as an adult, I still think of that weird encounter I had. This year, I'm spending Christmas Eve alone in my apartment. I decided to put on a Christmas movie to help me fall asleep. I slowly began drifting off. Upon waking up, it took me a moment to process what was happening. I could faintly hear jingle bells ring throughout my house, but I knew I didn't have any decorations with bells on them. That's whenever I began having the horrifying realization. Someone was definitely inside my house. I stood up and put my ear against my bedroom door. I backed up when I heard something like a fight happening. I ran back to my bed and dove under the blankets, due to my habit as a kid. I heard my bedroom door slowly open. Even though I was terrified, I lifted my blanket up slightly to see who it was. I let my eyes adjust slowly to the darkness, and I saw the creature from 15 years ago, right in front of me. The monster gave me a terrifying smile, and for some reason I felt relieved.
I saved you from them.
Was all it said, before it left for good. I was left there dumbfounded, but thankful. If that was never actually the monster, then who was?